So I'm here with Ryan Snell, and he's going to be teaching me domains as if I knew nothing about them because I know nothing about them.
You decided to get the domain expert.
Yep. So where do we begin, Ryan?
Well, I think in order to begin, we have to understand what a domain is, right? So I think a lot of us associate a domain with like a .com, like let's say google.com or yahoo.com. I think I probably ought to tell people a little bit on how that actually works. So there's actually something called ICANN. It's ICANN. It's I believe it's like the Internet Corporation for Assigned Names and Numbers. It's like a nonprofit that kind of manages all of the different registrars and TLDs. TLD is a top-level domain, so that would be a .com or a .net. Each one of those has its own registration, regulation, all that kind of stuff. And so in order to actually buy one, we don't actually do that here at RunSignup. We offer more of a bring your own domain kind of solution. So in order to start using domains on our platform, you first have to purchase one through a registrar. Common ones are like GoDaddy or name.com or places like that.
And you just bought one in under 5 minutes for this video, right?
Correct, yeah. So once you have your domain purchased and you want to connect that to your event on RunSignup or TicketSignup, it's pretty simple. All you have to do is go to the dashboard. I like to search. You can search domain. And if you click on this, it will pull up our add your domain page. One thing I should note is when you're adding a domain, if you go through with the entire path, you're actually making the website your domain. I know that sounds kind of obvious, but this is not just a link on our website that points to your website. If you go through with this, it will actually be the website. There's a lot of good reasons to do that, but I just want to make sure that people are on the same page, that if you have any other content, maybe through some other, like let's say WordPress or something like that, if you go through with this process, you're not going to be able to see that because it will be pointing to your website on RunSignup or TicketSignup. So I guess we have a new acronym, KNA. I'm not sure what that stands for quite yet, but KNA Extravaganza, that's the domain I purchased.
That's the one we wanted.
I think
it
so.
wasn't a
I think so.
miscommunication between us.
Not at all. What's the race that you want to put on?
I guess we could do it on this one.
Yeah, what's a good name for that?
KNA Extravaganza.
KNA Extravaganza.
So Ryan is buying a domain right now.
I'm working on it. Extravaganza. Wow, it's like I had to go do like a little spelling bee there. Is that what you did? Is that what you said?
That'll work.
Oh, you meant K and A.
K and A.
I heard that as K and A.
That works. That'll be fine.
So I have this purchased. I went to GoDaddy and purchased it. So when you purchase a domain, it has a bunch of DNS records here automatically, and I'll kind of explain what DNS here is in a minute. But let's just say we have our domain. It's purchased. I'm the rightful owner of this. So in order to add your domain, really all you have to do is, type in whatever the domain was here and click add. There's actually hundreds of top-level domains. We don't automatically support all of them necessarily, but these are some of the most common ones that we have on our platform. And then we've also added a few others. You have to click a little link to see more of them, but these are the ones that we currently have supported. Kind of let that process. So after we added our domain, there's multiple steps in order to get it to be real. We can't just type in google.com and just take ownership of that. There's different steps that we have to go through. So one of those steps is ownership validation. And the purpose of this is to prove that we actually control that domain. Now, why is this important? This is important for SSL certificates. SSL stands for Secure Socket Layer, and that's what kind of keeps your bits and bytes on the internet more encrypted and more safe from people that are trying to intercept your communications. And that kind of keeps things a little bit more secure in terms of data, credit card information, etc. In order to do this, we have to add TXT records. And TXT is a DNS record. DNS stands for Domain Name System. And that's kind of what really runs a lot of the internet. It's kind of like the MapQuest or Google Maps or whatever of the internet. You type google.com and it has to know where to go. There's a lot of servers out there in the world and it needs to know how to get there. So there's different DNS record types. There's TXT. That stands for text, so that's probably a pretty obvious one. Some of the other common ones are CNAME. That's canonical name. That basically says we can go from one domain to a different domain. It's still not going to resolve to a necessary, an actual address on the internet. For those that are familiar, an address would be like an IP address, Internet Protocol. There's also A records. A stands for address, and that's actually an IP address that would be associated with a specific domain. So we start with the TXT records. TXT records are kind of like metadata. They don't actually tell you anything in terms of which server to point to. They're just there to prove, hey, you have the right to edit that domain, basically. And so that's why we use TXT records here. It's to prove that we control the domain name records. So once we add these, which I'm going to do here in a minute, then we can kind of kick off that validation process of making sure that we actually control the domain. So let's go here and add a record. So I'm in GoDaddy. That's kind of what I'm using for this example here. So let's say TXT record. That's the type. We have these handy little clipboard buttons, which I recommend people use. That's the subdomain that we're using for our ownership validation here. We have to do 2 of these records, one for the root and one for the www subdomain. That's why we have 2 of them.
And what is a subdomain?
Subdomain is basically something in front of the root domain. So, for instance, maps.google.com, right? Maps would be the subdomain of google.com. Once you have the root domain, then you can theoretically add as many subdomains as you want for free.
So it's not a domain purchased by like a Hobie.
You're a real hero.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right. So once we have these added, all you have to do in GoDaddy here, I added both of them together. I'm going to hit this Save All Records button. And then that will go through DNS. I will say DNS records can take up to 48 hours to propagate through the internet. They don't always. I mean, sometimes they work pretty fast, but different registrars have different ways of updating them, and sometimes they may take a long time. So just want to caution people about that.
So now it's just a waiting game.
Yeah, so what we do here is we'll automatically check for an update every 30 minutes or so, and that's kind of our usual process for checking to make sure that that record got installed. And then once that's installed, then we'll go through the process of procuring an SSL certificate. That basically allows you to connect your browser to the domain in a secure fashion. That's one of the most important parts of bringing your own domain, is making sure that it's secure. After we have that, then we can go through the process of actually connecting the dots in terms of the CNAME and both the A record to actually link your domain to our content and our website. So once we go through ownership validation, you'll see there's some different steps here. We're going to do SSL certificate. Then we are actually going to provision our servers to accept requests. Only after then do we expose the next step that you have to take as a customer to bring your own domain, and that's the CNAME and the A records. We don't have people switch those out until we're actually 100% ready to go. The reason we do this is to make sure there's no downtime. So if you had a different website that was still taking traffic, the way that we have this ordered would really cut your downtime to just about 0 to make that transition.
Okay, so I see that our ownership validation has been checked.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, we set their TXT records in GoDaddy. I went out and grabbed myself a latte, came back, and now the ownership has been validated because we installed those TXT records. So the next step is that RunSignup is going to go get an SSL certificate, and we're going to do that in the background on your behalf. So now that we have it validated, now we can actually go and get an SSL certificate from a valid certificate authority that has the right to issue those certificates. Here at RunSignup, we use Let's Encrypt. It's by far like the most growing SSL certificate provider, mainly because their mission is to increase the amount of domains that have SSL on the internet. Previously, you had to pay for them and purchase them. Let's Encrypt does that for free. So an SSL certificate basically allows the domain to connect to your browser in a secure fashion, and really only applies just to that domain. It's a way to prove that you have obtained the rights to get that That's why we had to go through that process of ownership validation, because in order to issue that, they have to make sure that you own it. So that goes through something called a certificate authority. These are organizations or bodies that kind of have the right to issue these certificates, and that's managed through the various powers of the internet, I should say, in terms of who has the right to do that. It's a very exclusive club. There's not that many of them that have the right to do that. And Let's Encrypt was actually just recently added to that, probably in the last 10 years or so. I mean, that's kind of been really great for the internet because it allows many more domains to have SSL on by default. And, many browsers will actually throw a warning now if you connect to a non-SSL type of domain. So it's actually really important, and especially if you're taking credit card information.
And now, is this a certificate right here up on the screen?
Yeah, so these are some details of actually RunSignup's SSL certificate. This is the public information. In cryptography, there's a concept of a public key and a private key, and that's kind of how all this is managed. Obviously, the private key is not shown because it's, private. And so you get information on when the SSL certificate was issued, when it expires, as well as what domains it applies to. You can actually kind of look at the hierarchy of how it was validated, and there's a whole bunch of other information if you're curious. Let's Encrypt does 3-month SSL certificates. They do that intentionally to make sure that the window it's in that sweet spot of you have to refresh it regularly, but not too regularly.
And RunSignup handles the SSL certificate and renewing that, so that's not something that you have to do as the race director.
Correct. Yeah, so what we do with all of our domains, including customer domains, is we refresh them every 2 months. So we're staying 1 month ahead of that just in case an issue comes up. There's 2 different means that we use here to verify domains. The first one is those TXT records that we did. That's a one-time thing. So we do that to make sure that if you already had traffic coming to let's say a WordPress or a different type of website, you're not actually taking any traffic away just to prove that you own the domain. That's why we use TXT records. After that, once you're completed on your setup, we use a different strategy for validating those ownerships to get these SSL certificates, and we do what's called an HTTP verification. Basically, we have a little tiny page that's orphaned off that no one really sees that we have the rights to edit, because once you move your domain over, then we kind of can control the content on there. A really good thing for you is you get to take advantage of our website builder and all of our other good features. It automatically works. And the other thing is we get to control those little pieces of data that are used for validation for you. So once you have it all moved over, we're automatically refreshing that SSL certificate for you in the background. You don't have to think about it. I mean, once you're done with this setup, as long as you're continuing to pay your domain registrar every year or however many years your frequency is with them, and as long as the DNS records are intact, really there's nothing for you to do in order to keep the domain healthy and running. So now after we've established ownership, the SSL certificate has automatically been procured in the background. Now the next step is RunSignup's actually going to go install that domain. We do this automatically. We actually only run this during roughly East Coast daylight hours, just in case something happens while we're all sleeping, because we're actually refreshing some of the servers in the background. And so when we're done with this, then it will be ready to accept traffic. This process can take up to 30 minutes.
All right, so I see that the RunSignup installation has finished, and now we're ready for client installation.
Correct. Yeah. So now the next step is, now that we're completely ready for traffic, is to actually start driving traffic to our platform for your domain. And that's done through these A and C name records for our root domain. I think, as I said earlier, DNS is domain name system, and so there's different types of records. Now we're starting to get into 2 different types. There's A, which is address, and that points to an IP address. This is an example of an IP address here. This is one of our servers. For those of you that know, that's an IPv4 address. And then C name is a canonical name, and that points to basically a different domain. And so we use custom.runsignup.com for that. So this is an example of a root domain. If you were to install a subdomain, we only do a CNAME record. The difference for us is we prefer CNAMEs most of the time because we get to control the IP addresses. So if there's a need for us to update them, we can do that automatically. However, we intentionally only do those on the www for a root domain because if we did that on the root, then any other types of records that you have potentially could get messed up, like MX, which stands for mail exchange. That's used for emails. So like, let's say you had your own custom email address for your domain. We don't want to get in the middle of that and mess that up for you. So that's why we have an A record on the root. And what we do is we actually redirect people. So once this is done, if you go to the root domain, meaning you didn't type in www, we actually automatically will redirect them, and we'll force that redirect in the future. So that A record doesn't really see the light of day too much beyond people that are just typing in your domain for the first time. And so this is similar to how we did the TXT records, and we're going to take this information and kind of plug that in to our domain registrar's DNS zone editor. Again, we're using GoDaddy in this example, so I can go over here and I can add record. We're going to add 2 records, so I'll get that set up here. We're doing an A record, and we're doing a CNAME record. Again, I recommend people use our little handy copy buttons to make sure that you're not going to make a mistake. @ symbolizes the root, so we're going to type in @. The value is going to be one of our IP addresses, so we're going to put that in here. And for our CNAME, or canonical name, it's going to be www in this example, and we're going to point that to custom.runsignup.com. Now that we have that set up here, all I have to do is hit Save All Records in GoDaddy.
What is the half-hour thing there?
So the half hour is the time to live. That's basically how often the record can get cached throughout the internet.
And what happened here with the error we're seeing?
So this is a common error that people might see, and so this is actually quite good. What we've done is, although we purchased the domain, our registrar happened to have different plans for us. And so they added some other records down here that we actually need to clean up before we go through with this. So we have a CNAME of www. That's going to conflict, so I have to delete this. As well as an A record for @, which redirects to parked. We also need to delete this.
And what is parked?
Parked is kind of like a term for domain registrars to say that you own the domain, but there's no content. It's basically a way for them to advertise on your domain without you having any content on it.
And then that first one you deleted, I'm guessing that was just like
It's similar to what we do, so it would also have been parked.
It was kind of like a placeholder page that they made?
Yeah, so like, if you go there, they're going to have their own little ad on, hey, go buy a different domain from us, So now that we have those cleaned up, now we can go back up here and click Save All Records. And that should go through. Again, DNS records throughout the internet can take a long time. I often say 48 hours. Doesn't always happen, but sometimes I've seen it where it can take a very long time. So just be patient sometimes. So now that our DNS records are set up in that zone editor for our registrar, that's mostly all we have to do for this step. We're going to check automatically to see if you installed them correctly every half hour. But in the meantime, it's totally possible that your domain might be up and running. So, I recommend people make sure that this says complete. If you did not clean up your DNS records like I did in the previous step, you actually might be stuck on this step because let's say that A record that we had that was set to parked from before in my example, that would prevent us from moving this to the completed step.
Okay, so I see our domain is live now.
Yeah, so we're checking again in the background every half hour to see if things were installed correctly. Once we see that things were installed to the T, we move it to live, and so that's why our domain status got switched over to live. Now if I go to our domain that I purchased earlier and moved over, it actually works. Now this is pointing to our platform. If we make an edit in the dashboard, it's going to be observed here in real time, mirroring the website that you had set up on our website, except now that's on your domain.
And now our custom domain and also the regular RunSignup page is going to bring you to this page.
Yeah, both of them will still work. The advantage here is it's a lot smaller. You can go put this on different media, ad campaigns, email, and it will still point to the same exact website, but instead it's your domain. It looks a lot more professional.
Now, what are some errors that people might see when they're trying to set up their domain?
I would say one of the most common ones that I see is people that have conflicting records in their DNS editor. Example that we had earlier, right, was when we go to edit our domain, GoDaddy has a bunch of stuff in here by default, and likely other DNS editors do the same thing. I had to delete an A record that they had set up. I had to delete a CNAME record that they had set up. So before we add them, it wouldn't hurt to double check and delete some of those that might be conflicting when we're setting up the client installation step.
And now when you tried to set it up in GoDaddy, you got the error message on the CNAME, but not the A name?
Right. So the CNAME, you can only have one of them. And so that's why GoDaddy and other DNS editors probably will catch you on that. But with A records, they're an address. So you actually could have multiple of them. For instance, RunSignup, we do multiple. We always have at least 2. And on our platform, we have 4 actual IP addresses at any given point in time. Actually, I think we're up to 8 now. And so your browser is going to pick, your computer rather, it's going to pick one of those out of random in order to fulfill the request. And that's why GoDaddy would have let that through, even though it's not correct, because half of it could have been pointing to their traffic for their own advertising purposes versus redirecting to your website, which you probably would want.
So if somebody's stuck on the domain setup step, go into your
DNS editor at your domain registrar and take a look at the combination of the type as well as the name or the host. Sometimes they'll call it a host, and make sure that only the records that we have match that. And if you have duplicates, clean up the ones that we don't have listed in our setup page. And I should also say that your setup page is going to be different for each domain that you have set up, especially the TXT records, but also the CNAME and the A records. So if you're doing multiple domains at a time, make sure that you're only using the values for each race, ticket event, etc., in the respective dashboard for each one.
And what happens if somebody, instead of using the little copy buttons that we have, they accidentally type something wrong?
Yeah. So especially on those TXT records, I mean, you can even see it here right at the bottom. It's a long string. And so if you get that incorrect, even by one character, it doesn't matter. It has to be 100% correct. That's going to not work.
Now, are there any other errors that we typically see with domains?
There's 2 other types of errors that I see that happen quite a bit. One, not really an error, but let's say someone put on a one-time event and they decided they're not doing it again. From our perspective, we see that, which is fine. Like, let's say the event doesn't exist anymore. They didn't renew the domain. That's an obvious one. If you want to keep your domain, you just got to make sure you're paying your bill on the domain registrar to keep it alive.
And if someone stops paying for their domain and they lose that domain, what's going to happen on the RunSignup side?
So after a while, we're going to detect that, and we're going to stop attempting to get a new SSL certificate. So if you go through that process, you don't really have to do anything necessarily from your perspective. If you want to use it again, obviously you'd have to purchase the domain again, and you might have to set it up again on our site, because it's very likely after a few months we'll have canceled your domain request. Basically what that says is we're not treating it anymore. We're not accepting any more traffic for it because we can't, because we don't have an SSL certificate, because your domain doesn't exist. The other one is going to be if people go into their DNS editor and they start making edits. That's another thing I see a lot. People might go in, they might delete that A record thinking it's not actually needed. But if they do that, people that type in your root domain for the first time, it's not going to go anywhere. Although your www might work, the root's not going to work. The consequence of that is we're not going to be able to get a new SSL certificate for you. And we don't want that, because we want your domain to be up and running. So once you have things set up, basically leave those A and C name records alone. That will give you a better experience and make sure that your domain stays up healthy for the lifetime of your event.
Well, thanks, Ryan.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thanks for being our expert on domains.
I guess you could call me a domain expert. Get the subject matter expert in here next.